Hi. This week we will shift from ancient literature to medieval literature, starting with A Thousand and One Nights. You may be familiar with this set of story and know it more as Arabian Nights, but that title can be a little a little misleading. While the stories were collected primarily in Arab countries, the tales themselves are borrowed, or rather stolen, from countries across the Middle East, Northern Africa, Persia, and even into India and parts of China. Because of the vast geographical span, scholars have shifted the title to represent a more accurate description, Thousand and One Nights. Just a heads up, this lecture will be a little bit longer than normal because we won't be having a second lecture on the tales themselves because each tale is individualized. Additionally, we're going to talk about the opening of Thousand and One Nights, which is a little bawdy, and there's a lot of sex in it and murder. So keep that in mind. Okay, so A Thousand and One Nights has a long, complicated history, and we're just going to go over it briefly. The Nights are known to have no known author, nor does it have a known origin. Many of the tales depicted in it have collected roots and parallels from cultures spanning from Egypt to the Middle East to Persia, down into Western China and India, as we talked about on the last slide. However, they were collected and readily shared throughout Arabian culture during the medieval times. The first known collection of the tales was translated into Arabic from the Persian around 850 AD and was simply called A Thousand Legends. Around 100 years later, a historian mentions that, quote, the people call A Thousand and One Nights an encyclopedia of folk history, and while the description of the prologue is similar to that which survives today, there's not enough mention of the rest of the collection to know if it's the same or how much of it differs. For about 600 years, the tales were collected and shared throughout Arab culture. There are records of countless transcripts of these, varying in degrees, most of which appear to be poorly constructed retellings with personal stories added to the folk tales. So basically, people are just adding where they wanted to go. In the late 1700s, Egypt finalized a version, or rather the first of the versions that we have today, and that was collected in Egypt. The language was vulgar, the tales were descriptively bawdy, and due to the style and language, which differ significantly from classically written Arabic language and literature, which is rarely translated into English, most scholars typically agree that the tales were collected for the masses and were shared amongst the uneducated. By the early 1800s, French and English colonizers, or colonialists rather, colonizers too, had translated the tales into what we now recognize as A Thousand and One Nights. However, because there isn't a definitive original text, as with the Iliad or the Ramayana, there are hundreds of variations of the tales, depending on which translation you get, which culture it stems from, when it was translated, etc. And many of the tales have been highly, highly revised to make appropriate for small children. Now, A Thousand and One Nights is perhaps one of the most famous and well-known frame narratives in the world. A frame narrative is, as the name suggests, a grouping of stories that are framed by a single narrative that connects the seemingly unrelated stories together. Typically, frame narratives have two parts. They have the outer narrative, or the outer frame, and the inner story, or stories. The outer frame opens and closes the collection of inner stories, and the outer frame provides readers and listeners with important context and key information on how to interpret the stories within. In addition to context and thematic connections to the inner stories, the outer frame also provides a sense of reliability of its author. Often these narratives are framed with I heard this from a traveler, or This isn't my story, but I'm telling it to you. This removal of the narration to a heard by rather than an experienced by offers the narrator a little bit of a relinquished responsibility should the tale offend the reader or the listener. In other words, it's a this isn't mine, so don't get mad at me if you don't like what I say. This format is particular of older frame narratives where literary offenses could be seen as amoral and even unlawful. However, the most popular frame narratives use the outer frame to provide more context than to push reliability off on others. Some of our most famous frame narratives use the outer frame to establish how we interpret the story that's being told to us. This style of storytelling is very popular. You're probably pretty much familiar with it and with frame narratives already, even if you don't realize it. And here are some really famous ones that you probably know. But instead of going with literature, we're going to go with movies because more of us see movies than we read books, probably. Although that's kind of sad. So first off, the 1987 classic Princess Bride has the outer narrative of the grandpa coming to read to his sick young grandson. But the inner story is a cohesive tale of true love and revenge. Fun fact, the 1973 novel of the same name is also a frame narrative, with William Goldman, who also wrote the screenplay of the movie, presenting that this is just the good parts of a much older classic novel originally written by S. Morgenstern. There is no S. Morgenstern, and there is no original classic story that he's telling. But he sets up the novel, and again later the film, in this manner. Goldman seems to be suggesting that if you don't like this story, it's not his fault, blame this other guy. So we get a little bit of that reliability here. That's not always the case, though. Another really famous one that you might be aware of is the 1993 film Forrest Gump, which also provides us with a frame narrative. The outer narrative weaves in and out of the film with a grown Forrest Gump sitting on a park bench in Savannah, Georgia, waiting for the bus, sharing his chocolate and stories with anybody who sits down with him. But the inner stories, unlike The Princess Bride, are all Gump's own stories. And slowly, the outer narrative demonstrates how we should interpret these strange tales of Forrest Gump's life, ultimately bringing us, and spoiler, to his raising the son that he fathered with Jenny. Without the outer narrative, we might reach the same conclusions as we do with it. But the famous claim, life is like a box of chocolates, but you never know what you're going to get, lets us know early on that this is going to be a wild tale. We don't know where it's going to go at any given time. Moreover, the presence of Forrest sitting on that bench, dressed in that linen suit, creates a sense of reliability. Here, though, the reliability isn't pushed off on someone else, as Goldman does with The Princess Bride. Instead, Gump is preparing the audience to believe this crazed life that he's lived, from influencing Elvis Presley with his dance moves, to running across the country multiple times, to investing in Apple, etc. Without Gump's frame narrative, these wild stories will feel too impossible. But the reliability of Gump sitting there telling us these allows us to suspend our disbelief and believe in the tale. However, frame narratives can also provide context for the story that doesn't approach how we interpret the reliability of the text. For instance, James Cameron's 1997 Titanic has two outer narratives at play: The Search for the Heart of the Ocean and The Elderly Rosa's Story. The outer narrative starts with the search for the heart of the ocean, that big gem that they're all looking for. This gives us a reason to go exploring the wreckage of the Titanic. It also brings us Elderly Rose. And while the search remains the initial narrative, structuring the entire purpose of getting Rose's story allows us to revisit the tales of the last few hours and days of the Titanic. While the bulk of the inner story is the love saga of Rose and Jack, the heart of the ocean is a constant, from the draw me like one of your French girls while wearing the gem to Cal giving Rose his coat, which, unbeknownst to her, has the gem in the pocket. The necklace, the necklace is in the pocket. And finally, the outer narrative concludes the inner story. Spoiler, not with the death of Jack out in the freezing waters, but with elderly Rose dropping the necklace back into the sea to remain with the lost souls of the wreck. So we have kind of a two-part weaving within the inner story within it, but Rose's story is also kind of within it. So it's kind of like a middle ground, right? It's a little bit more complex. Okay, so now that we have a pretty good idea of how frame narratives can work and how they can work in different situations, A Thousand and One Nights has a wide range of depictions and no real connections within their stories. So Princess Bride, Forrest Gump, Titanic, all of those stories seem very connected. We know what this is. We see the story. But for Thousand and One Nights, none of these stories are connected. There's no interlocking characters or anything like that, except for in the outer frame narrative. So here's the outer story, because we're not going to read this part of it. And also note, this is my heavily revised retelling, and depending on the translation can change how it's presented quite a bit, but for the most part, they all hit these basic concepts and principles. So, sit back for some storytelling. Long ago, there were two royal brothers, and when their father died, the two brothers split the kingdom, and each ruled half. After years apart, the elder brother, who we'll call the Sultan, wished to see his younger brother, who we'll just call brother, as he missed having an equal to talk to. So he sent his vizier to invite his brother for a visit. Brother readily agreed, and the Sultan summons and prepared to take the trek from his kingdom to his brother's. It was not long on the road before the brother realized he had forgotten the giant pearl that he was going to give as a gift to the Sultan. And not being far from home, he decided to turn around, get the gift, and then continue on his way. Upon entering the royal chambers to retrieve the gift, the brother discovered his wife passionately in bed with one of the palace slaves. Outraged that she would shame him so quickly upon leaving, the brother pulled out his rapier and slaughtered them both. Then he changed his clothes, grabbed the pearl, and left to visit the Sultan. The Sultan was pleased with the pearl, but instantly noticed that his brother was depressed. He repeatedly asked him what was wrong, but got no reply. Remembering how much his brother loved to hunt, the Sultan arranged for a hunting trip, but the brother turned it down as well. Furious that he could not shake what ailed his brother, the Sultan went ahead with the hunt, leaving his brother behind. While the Sultan was out hunting, the brother sits at a window contemplating what to do next. How to return to his kingdom? Should he find a new wife? Are all women this horrible? Etc. You know, as you do after you murdered your wife and her lover. While looking out in the courtyard, he sees the Sultan's wife enter with many of the palace girls and slaves. They situate themselves around the courtyard before the Sultana, the Sultan's wife, approaches one of the slaves, strips him and herself of their clothes, and proceeds to have sex with him in the open courtyard. With barely a response, the palace girls do the same, each selecting a slave, stripping, etc. The brother is shocked to discover the Sultan's wife would behave in the same manner that his own wife did, and with her husband only barely having left for the hunt. When the Sultan returns, the brother confesses everything that he's seen. The Sultan is furious. He refuses to believe that it's true, and so the two brothers create a plan to catch the wife in the passions of lovemaking. The next day, they orchestrate a plan, and when the Sultan catches his wife in the arms of a new lover, the brothers murder the entire courtyard participants. Bewildered that such a betrayal could happen to both of them, the Sultan and his brother, they set out to see if such an affliction is common among other kingdoms. I'm not really certain how they're going to do this, but they've got a plan, right? Because who's going to admit that their wife's cheating on them? But it's their plan, and I digress. After many a day's journey, the brothers find a lone tree on the edge of the ocean. Tired, but not wanting to be swept away by the tides, they climb up the tree for protection and fall asleep. But they are soon awoken by a clap of thunder. Awake, the brothers watch as the sea parts and a genie carrying a large trunk emerges from the depths of the oceans. The brothers quietly watch as the genie opens the trunk after trunk, each getting smaller, until a most beautiful woman they have ever seen emerges from the smallest of trunks. The genie has his way with her, and then immediately falls into a deep sleep. While the woman is laying there with the genie, she looks up and sees the brothers watching from the tree. She easily escapes from the genie's arms, though her foot is bound to the massive trunks, and she calls up into the tree to the brothers. "He will sleep for ages. There's no waking him after he's had his fill. Come down and fill me with your rapiers, for I have never seen a man as brave as you to sit above a genie." The brothers call down, "How did you come to be?" And the woman says, "The genie captured me on my wedding night and now keeps me captive in these trunks under the sea. He takes me out only when he wants womanly contact. I am his slave." The brothers are still hesitant, but they're also struck by the woman's story and her beauty. So the woman calls up again, "If you will not let me have you, I will make my master the genie, and he will surely kill you for watching us." Scared for their lives, but also intrigued by this beautiful woman, the brothers climb down the tree and proceed to bed the woman as she requested. When they are done, the woman pulls from her pocket a string of 98 rings and proclaims, "Give me your signet rings, you are my 100th bedding." And then she dismisses the brother and returns to the genie's sleeping arms. Bewildered, the brothers wander back towards the Sultan's kingdom. "Imagine," exclaimed the Sultan, "if such a woman's treachery can happen to even a genie who is as powerful as he, it must happen to all men." As the border of the kingdoms, or at the border of the kingdoms, the brothers parted ways, each questioning how they can overcome such trickery of women. After sleeping on his discoveries, the Sultan calls his visitor to his chambers, proclaiming, "Each day you will bring me a virgin to marry, and to keep her honest and pure to only me, you will have her executed at dawn after we have consummated the marriage." The vizier bows, and the Sultan's will becomes law for 3 years. For 3 years, a new wife every night, only to be executed the next morning. After 3 years, the vizier has trouble finding virgins willing to wed and bed the Sultan, only to be killed the next day. The money that their families get is not worth it, they say. Many have tried to convince him to spare their lives, but each time the Sultan looks to his hand where his signet ring should rest and orders their death. With so few women available, the vizier's eldest daughter, Scheherazade, approaches him. "Father," she says, "let me wed the king. Either I die as Allah wishes, or I deliver the women from this treachery. Whichever way, it is as Allah wishes." The vizier knows there's no other way for his beloved daughter to survive when no woman has. So he tells her a story, hoping to change her mind. But her mind is not altered. But she does hatch a plan. Before leaving for the castle, Scheherazade tells her youngest sister that once she has bedded the king, or the Sultan rather, she will call her for her, and that her sister must ask her for his story. After the Sultan finishes with her, Scheherazade asks the Sultan if she can see her beloved sister one last time. When her sister enters the Sultan's chamber, she breaks down into tears. "Oh, sister, I will surely miss you now that you are the Sultan's queen. For our last night together, can you finish the story you began when you left?" But sister, Scheherazade responds, we are in the middle of the story and the Sultan will be lost. Quick to catch on, Scheherazade's sister exclaims, if the Sultan is willing, perhaps you can start the story anew. The Sultan, intrigued by a story so riveting, a sister would ask to hear the end, knowing the teller will be dead in the morning. So he permits Scheherazade to tell her tale from the beginning. But Scheherazade has tricked the Sultan. Each night she ends one story and begins another that is never concluded by morning. And each morning she exclaims, only if I had another night to tell the tale, you would know how it ends. And each morning, for 1,001 nights, or 1,001 mornings, the Sultan permits her one more night. Now, how this story concludes changes significantly between versions and regions where the copies of the frame narrative have been found. But each time, by the end of the 1,001 Nights, the Sultan is so impressed by Scheherazade's ability to convince him to live that he grants her life, and they live happily ever after. In some of them, he looks around and realizes that they have multiple kids by this point, and that maybe he should let the mother of his children live. In some of them, he's fallen madly in love with her by this point. It all just kind of changes. But that will prepare you for the outer narrative before reading two of the most famous inner stories from 1001 Nights. As you can tell, the Nights is often considered bawdy in nature. There's a lot of killing and a lot of sex throughout the whole thing. There's also thieving and other low-brow stories. If you want one that's particularly fun and only 2 pages, read The Historic Fart. It perfectly demonstrates that gassy fears have always been part of human nature. It's also a lot of fun. So I'll see you in Hypothesis, and happy reading.